Aloha and welcome to the 43rd Annual Hawaii International Film Festival presented by Halekulani, and the first in our Film for Thought discussion series in partnership with the Hawaii Council for the Humanities. We're in conversation with the filmmakers from No Maori Allowed and Still We Rise today. My name is Anna Page. I'm the Director of Programming at the festival, and I'm really honored to present this conversation to you today. Our Film for Thought program is in its 13th year, and this program combines thought-provoking film with scholarly discussion. These are two incredible films that we're very excited to be presenting at the festival this year. We will have two in-person screenings at Kahala Theaters. You can find the full schedule and information regarding those screenings online at HIFF43. We'll also be welcoming the director of No Māori Allowed, Corinna Hunziker, to the festival. She'll be joining us in person, so we will also be having an in-person conversation with her after the screening. Before we get started today, I just want to give a brief introduction to everyone. We, of course, have Corinna Hunziker, who is the director of No Māori Allowed. We're in conversation also with John Harvey, the director of Still We Rise. And today's conversation will be moderated by Shannon Pōmaika Hennessy. She's a PhD student in Indigenous politics at the University of Hawai at Manoa. Shannon Pōmaika Hennessy is interested in cultivating and recognizing Indigenous resurgence, strengthening Hawaiian identities, highlighting Indigenous women, confronting class discrepancies in Hawaii, and fostering oceanic solidarities. Before we get started today, I'd also like to introduce and bring forward Liz Soto from the Hawaii Council for the Humanities to speak a little bit more about this year's Film for Thought program and our theme for this year, United We Stand. Welcome, Liz.
Mahalo, Anna. Thank you. Yes. So as Anna said, I'm Liz Soto, Director of Literary and Conversation Programming at the Hawaii Council for the Humanities, where our mission is to connect people with ideas that enrich lives, broaden perspectives, and strengthen communities. Our Film for Thought collaboration with Hawaii International Film Festival is always a highlight of our programming year. So mahalo to everyone at HIFF, especially you, Anna, for being our partner in this endeavor for more than 10 years. It's been an amazing journey. So United We Stand, our theme for 2023 Film for Thought, is a phrase that is so often heard in the United States, but the second half of the saying, divided we fall, is frequently left unsaid. It is assumed that it's already known, but what remains unknown, and what are we perhaps not asking when we hear United We Stand? In a society that places a particular emphasis on the freedoms of the individual, what does it mean to stand united? This theme is also part of the National Endowment for the Humanities United We Stand Connecting Through Culture funding for its national network of state and juridical humanities councils to support local programming that helps communities counter the destructive effects of hate-fueled violence on our democracy and public safety. The essays written by our Film for Thought scholars ask us to deepen our understanding of these films and further push us to consider what it means to be united, particularly when significant parts of our societies have been and continue to be systematically disenfranchised from dominating cultures and narratives. So we ask the questions: why are we united? What are we uniting for? What are we standing for? Who is standing with us? Who is standing for us? So thank you so much again for being a part of this conversation, and mahalo.
All right. Aloha mai kako, kia ora koutou, kapu bai tuangu. O Shannon Pōmaika Hennessy ko'u inoa, no Niu Oahu mai au. So my name is, hello, greetings. My name is Shannon Pōmaika Hennessy. I'm from Niu Oahu in Hawaii. And I'm very, very excited to be here with Corinna and John today to talk about such important, relevant, critical works that they've provided for us. And I'm excited especially to talk about them in conversation with each other and with both of you Indigenous filmmakers here to discuss your work today. So mahalo for being here. Let's see. So I wanted to start with as we do in Indigenous spaces, starting with our origin stories. So in terms of this project, I did a little bit of research before about where you might have found some of your origin stories. So John, it sounds like you've mentioned in previous interviews, your conversations with the Gunbangir activist and academic Gary Foley, who was featured in your film and formed a lot of the creative direction of your work. And Corinna, given the title of your film and the relation of your work to the book by the same name by American historian Robert Bartholomew, I wondered if your introduction to this issue was through that book. So the question here is, how did you both encounter the topics of your documentary, and what motivated you to transform your topic into a full-fledged documentary project? So maybe Corinna, you could go first.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ka tuku tēnei mihi ki a koutou mō te tautoko o taku kiriata, No Māori Allowed. Just want to give a big thank you very much for supporting and our film, and for bringing us together to have this conversation. I'm super looking forward to hearing what John has to say as well. I guess, yes, the question is, I did come across this, the book, I think it was in 2018 when I was working on a different project, and I saw an article in a newspaper and I just went, that's an incredible story, and one that I'm really passionate about. I think telling really difficult Indigenous stories, creating really hard conversations, that's something that I'm really always seeking to find ways to stimulate conversation.
Mahalo. John?
Yeah, couple of things. Thank you for, good morning, and thank you for having me. Thank you to the festival for sharing this story, and also just want to acknowledge I'm on Gubbi Gubbi country in Australia, and my family's from Saibai Island, my dad's from England, and just acknowledge your people as well. And just here we are gathered together across that beautiful big ocean that connects us all, and it's really special and very special to have this and hear our stories together and feel those connections between us all. So thank you. I think this film, so Still We Rise is around a protest in 1972 for land rights in Australia for Indigenous people. And I think part of the genesis, I guess, of the project was the broadcaster was interested. It was coming up to the 50-year anniversary last year. So they were interested in reflecting, I guess, on the events of 72, and also just as a marker to think about, how far we've come or not in terms of land justice in this country. So I think that kind of, it was a story that I'd heard about growing up, and it's funny, it's because it's kind of one of those stories that are there, but until you start researching, I didn't realize how little I knew about the overall kind of detail across the country. So it was, fascinating to hear from that, and to share those stories, of what was said 50 years ago.
Yeah, mahalo. So it sounds like both of your work kind of entered your life at a particular moment, and a moment that made, your own personal interests and skills, it seemed like a very viable and clearly beautiful path forward for you both. And it's important to me to talk about the fact that you both are Indigenous filmmakers. So renowned Maori filmmaker, as we know, Taika Waititi, upon receiving and accepting an Academy Award in 2020, said to other Indigenous artists, especially the young ones, "We are the original storytellers and we can make it here as well." So you're both approaching this work, as I said, as filmmakers of Indigenous descent. How did your indigeneity influence your work and the way you tell this story?
I think I'll jump in here. I guess mine comes from a lot of personal experience of kind of experiencing racism as a child. I think as a Māori Indigenous person of my own country, and also hearing lots of stories around, you know, my parents or my mother and all her siblings not being allowed to speak their own language at school and receiving corporal punishment for it. And I think it was all those kind of experiences that really, I guess, I could have empathy or some kind of place to jump off from in terms of the story that I was approaching and these stories of these old people who had never shared their story before. I could understand where they were coming from, and this idea that they'd never been heard, they'd never received any healing except for within their own tiny little whānau family, but not in the big world. Does that kind of answer your question?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think what you're saying about the healing or the trauma, of course, first of the stories of both your tupuna as well as your own experience, and kind of empathizing with the ways that these kuya might have experienced that as well in a different way, one that you wanted to be heard. Absolutely. John?
Yeah, it's I think with Still We Rise, it's made entirely of archival material. So a lot of the footage is from news footage. There's some from films, and so I think, you know, it's point of view. So as an Indigenous person, you know, living here, experiencing this time, there's a point of view in viewing that material, and what might be interesting for a news broadcast, you know, a national broadcast, and has a different resonance, I guess, for Indigenous people when they're hearing that, you know, and I think, you know, all of those things inform, and, you know, and how we listen to people, you know, and I think for me it was really important to get first-hand accounts of this story, because I was aware that there's a lot of footage there. It was sort of the first time in Australia where there became kind of a national movement, and so I knew it was there somewhere, but it was just about you know, find those archives and I guess reclaiming those archives. You know, like we know that a lot of the history in this country has been written from a particular perspective. And so the opportunity for this film was to dive into those archives and reframe some of those perspectives from our own perspective, and to show some of the resonance of what it meant for communities in that battle. And an important thing for our film was, you know, which I think sort of ties into the theme here too, you know, United We Stand. It's a protest film, and it was power of the people. So, you know, I certainly wanted to hear from that, the breadth of Indigenous communities across Australia, who were all in their own right in the early 70s, late 60s, you know, had been having their own experiences of colonisation in this country. And, you know, this discussion where communities started to speak to each other and then gather at the footsteps of our parliament in Canberra to protest their concerns and raise their concerns directly to government officials. And I think, because from a non-Indigenous perspective in the news broadcast, that's, you know, it's the troublemakers. It's like, oh, what are they arguing about now? What are they protesting about? So, you know, from an Indigenous perspective, I wanted audiences to when they're watching people protest, they feel what the people are feeling. So that energy, because in a news clip it's 20 seconds or 30 seconds, and they use it in a particular way to portray people. But I wanted people to feel where that was coming from, and that this was a national feeling that people were having right across the country.
Can I jump in there? I think totally what John is, I just want to jump off what you're saying, John, about like that idea of like you wanting the audience to feel what those people are going through from their perspective. And I think we definitely approach No Māori Allowed like that too, like not wanting to point fingers or blame anybody for the experiences, but just kind of give a platform to share feelings and memories of the past. And I think that was something that we tried we worked really hard in the edit to approach their story that way. Trying to help people to feel, what does it feel like to be in their shoes?
Yeah, mahalo for that. What I'm hearing from both of you, oh, sorry, John, were you trying to respond?
I was just going to say, like, even like there was a bit of footage, the news footage, but you know, even just the use of cameras and lighting in studios in news footage. So, you know, from the 60s and 70s, the way that the studios are lit, you know, they're lit for lighter skin tones of the reporters and not necessarily the Indigenous people in there. So that affects the audience, like even in the physical thing of what's captured affects people's connection. You know, the connection with, you know, First Nations people speaking up about, you know, their rights. So, I mean, that was even just, you know, from an Indigenous perspective, like we can see that, hey, people aren't lit properly. And so, you know, to have that ability to look at that in our post-production process so that we were able to bring more connection with our voices.
Yeah, absolutely. What I'm hearing from you both is a kind of listening and a kind of watching with care and seeing with care is something you both brought to your work. And I can see it so clearly. It's so evident in your work how much care went into both of your documentaries, which as much as they do both speak to very similar issues and values, the focus and the tone are quite different between both of your documentaries. So for John, I did want to hear more about what you're saying about how you wanted to make the audience feel. Your documentary is not the typical documentary with, you know, interviews from like the experts from the Academy. It has so many exciting graphics and music that it really does feel like a movement as you are watching a movement. So I was wondering if you could speak more to this narrative style you have in your documentary and that feeling that you were hoping to evoke, because it's so distinctive and so exciting and so engaging.
Yeah, thank you. I think the thing for me was there was a couple of things in that. It was important that there was certainly an energy around that time, the end of the 60s. We had a referendum here, and including Indigenous people within our census, and that was in 67. And you know, they were talking kind of Vietnam War, Vietnam protests, apartheid in South Africa. There was a lot of protests in Australia at that time, and an incredible energy at that time. And you know, I was just kind of really struck by that energy in the footage. And you know, I thought about how people could experience that, and it made sense to hear the first-hand accounts and try to really bring that energy into the film. So that kind of informed it quite a bit. The other thing too was, you know, I think I heard this quote from Werner Herzog that facts do not constitute the truth, and I think there's something in that for us human beings and how we relate to each other. Like, you know, I think, because like talking about land justice, they're just two completely different things, and connection and ownership are just, the paradigms are so far apart, and clearly this system isn't working for Indigenous people to express and assert their connection with country within this kind of Western legal framework. So I was quite aware about how do you express that? How do you express what people are feeling? And, you know, so for me, part of that was using poetry from the time, and using some footage and kind of recutting that footage to represent this kind of history that had occurred in this country, without it becoming an exercise of intellect. You know, that this is, you know, I just wanted people to sit with an open spirit and just to hear the story, and then to let it sit with them and sit after and be able to reflect on that. And so, yeah, I guess in kind of, you know, threading the pieces together, in telling the story, that was the kind of the main kind of goal of it, I guess, was to have that experience. And you know, for an Indigenous storytelling perspective as well, that, you know, stories are told through music, through dance, through movement, you know, through kind of a mirror of ways. And I think, you know, sometimes it's really easy with film because it's kind of this Western form, and then there's these structures in film. And the hard thing is for Indigenous filmmakers too, I reckon sometimes, is just like, how do you try to maintain your kind of cultural sovereignty in storytelling using this particular medium? You know, I think we've had lots of experience, say, with visual art and sort of really owning the medium, but, you know, film's still relatively a new medium that we're all kind of playing with in our communities. So part of it for me was kind of exploring that a little bit as well.
Yeah, mahalo. I can definitely sense that. I sensed especially the way that the timeline you communicated was not linear. It was a lot of the young activist mentioning something and then you jumping back and explaining what had happened. And I found that to be very Indigenous, very indicative of a circular way of telling a story. In the same vein, Corinna, I noticed an aspect of Indigenous storytelling that might not be explicit to some, but in Hawaiian we have a word, kuleana, and kuleana means right, responsibility, or privilege. So it's important in this word too to acknowledge the connections we have with the land and with each other. And I saw you wrestling with kind of a kuleana of the actors in your film, kind of what were, like, who had the authority to tell the story, what were the ethical obligations of each person to tell their story. And this question of who has the kuleana is very important in the Hawaiian world, and I imagine very important in Te Ao Māori as well. And I imagine you had a wealth of content from which to shape your documentary, but you allot a lot of time to this one question of who has the right to tell the story. So I wanted to ask you more about that and why you chose to focus on that question.
Great question. And I just want to start it off by acknowledging the team, Megan Jones, who was my mentor, producer, and mentor director over No Māori Allowed, and was really pivotal and really helping me to see the world and how to navigate all these multiple characters and what their wants were, and how to help them express themselves. And then also Krishla Dillon, who was the editor of No Māori Allowed, and we had the most amazing, incredible conversations around who are we making this for, and a lot of other conversations, and also Reikura Kahi, who's the other producer, who has connections and whakapapa back to the people actually in the film. So, it was a real team effort. I think when we're talking about all these things of, direction and a narrative and approach, there's a lot of toing and froing around, because sometimes you just get lost in the middle and the muddle of it all, which I'm sure if John had lots of archive, there would have been a lot of kind of like how to weave. I think, who owns the narrative? And that was something that really came up a lot, I think. That was incredible. And I think one of the big things I learned from Megan was just about following the truth, or following their truth, and where's that going to lead you? You kind of don't know, you just keep following it. But what was interesting was, I think, we really wanted to give the protagonist, but also the antagonist, lovely Brian, who I love, Brian Golding, who's the local historian in the film. He was a voice for his family, who are generations deep in Pukekohe, and who are a representation of people coming from England to begin a new life in New Zealand because they were promised land, and so he's proud of his hard work and his family heritage, and that was really important to give him a voice and to let him speak proudly about his heritage and his cultural identity. And and he has a turning point too, where he is like, well, I know it was hard for them, I didn't know what to do, essentially, is kind of what he comes to realize. But I think, and then the old people, being angry at the young Māori people, and the young Māori people are wanting to shout out about it and get everyone talking about this, and then the old Māori people are going, how can you do that when we haven't even been heard? Like, what about, you can't do that, that's not tika, that's not right, there's a process, and this is the process. So it was just, honestly, there was a lot. It took us a little while to figure out how to navigate all of those different wants and needs for everybody in the story, and to find a way that they would be proud when they watched back the way that they were represented. And it was a massive learning curve for me.
Yeah, it sounds like it, that that effort to give voice to, you say, the antagonist, right? That is a massive feat in a film called No Māori Allowed, that's about discrimination against Māori folks. So I think your attention to the hearing and the seeing of these people with care is lovely, and so clear in the film itself. So this question I wanted to direct at you both. In terms of content, you both deal with racism against Indigenous people living under settler colonialism. And for me, I'm a PhD student, so I'm kind of pie in the sky intellectual sometimes, all the time. And I'm thinking about how it's important for me to recognize that extra layer of indigeneity when we're talking about this racism. To look at both of the discrimination and oppression both the Aboriginal activists and Māori from Pukekohe in this period faced, without acknowledging this other aspect. It's to see it incompletely, right? You have to see it with this theft of Indigenous land. And we see this, right? In Still We Rise, you have Aboriginal activists fighting for Black Australia for land rights. And from another angle, in No Māori Allowed, we have that critical context of the 1863 declaration that required Māori to surrender to the Queen or be evicted or sent away from their land. So what, if anything, did this project, this work, reveal to you about racism? and what do you hope it'll reveal to your viewers about racism?
I know that for the conversations that we had in the edit suite and with production as well, was really about why we're making this. And because, you know, it could have been, we could have approached it just as a really, you know, I guess pointing fingers type of angle. We could have done that. But this was really about trying to create a conversation, because at the same time that we made this, there was a lot of conversation in the New Zealand school history being taught in New Zealand schools, where for decades they've been teaching English history or history from around the world, but never our history, the history of Aotearoa. So that was changing the same year that we were making this doco. And so that became part of the story, because it's like, how can you not talk about your past? And this was part of the past. This was part of acknowledging it. The kind of idea, there's lots of to and fro around teaching New Zealand history in schools, because there's a lot of people who think that we will possibly be passing on a lot of white guilt to young Pākehā children that are in schools, but that is not how it's being approached. I think there's a lot of scaremongering around, you know, I think that intergenerational trauma and that being passed on to the next generation, that these young kids are now going to be accountable for their forebears and the things that they did. It's not about that. It was really, I think, about trying to paint a picture of, like, let's be honest about who we are, where we've come from, but that doesn't mean to say that that's who we're going to continue to be. And we've actually got an opportunity to embrace who we are and find a way to move forward. Yes, we still carry a lot of trauma, you know, and I think that's still going to take a long time for us to work through all of that. But really, when it came down to it, was like, why do we want to make this film? We want to create a conversation. We want to talk about the problem of racism that we have in New Zealand. And sometimes it's really subtle, sometimes it's really obvious. So this was just really about trying to find a way that, you know, the title No Māori Allowed, it's like that can be really off-putting for non-Māori who see that. But so we wanted to find a way to invite everybody to watch our film that doesn't is not accusatory. It's just like, this is what happened, so how can we do it better?
Mahalo.
Right. Sounds incredible, Corinna. Just listening to you and speak about your film, just incredible. And the nuances and what you and your team have obviously done, you know, to find the right space for the story, to hold the story and share it in that way. It's just incredible. Yeah, it sounds incredible. Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Racism, and, you know, certainly, you know, the news kind of structures often kind of sort of set themselves up for that on playing on things like there was clearly, you know, violence kept coming up in the news footage, and the Black Panthers, and, you know, a call to arms, and, you know, constantly, you know, Indigenous leaders were being asked, are you taking up arms? Do you have a hit list of people? People say you have a hit list. You know, there was just this constant thing, you know, which was fed by this fear, which in many ways reflected the history, the colonial history of this country. And I remember one of the people, I think it's Paul Coe, well, actually probably a few of them, say that, well, you know, if you want to talk about violence, let's talk about violence in this country, because we have been on the receiving end of your violence for, you know, a couple of 100 years. And, you know, there's lots of violence, and you know, but it's just that complete void of understanding, and you know, I think trying to just kind of crack through that often, because I think what was clear with this film with land justice is it's driven by an economic imperative, you know, and from a Western point of view, you know, that land that those First Nations people have their feet on, it's a lot of money. It's, oops, sorry, what's that? That was
The
interesting.
news. It's the news coming for us.
Yeah. And you know, there's an economic imperative to round up people, to take them off their land, to access that land, to exploit that land, to make lots and lots of money off that land and become, you know, whatever. So that was kind of a clear part of showing how these structures are working to suppress people, and that between the government and, you know, with this case, you know, big mining companies, that they were coming together to do things, you know, and even, you know, people finding out that their land is being taken by watching the news, you know, like no conversation, you know, and I think, you know, it's, you know, it's racism, and it's just as such, but in many ways in this film, it feels like completely different worlds, absolutely completely different worlds, and you know, let's set up these structures that empower the colonial power and suppress you, so we can do what we need to do. And you know, and if you challenge those, then we'll just move these laws a little bit, you know, to make it fit. So it's kind of it's all through the film, but I think part of the thing too was there was a bigger conversation here too, because, you know, Paul Coe says, well, this system, it doesn't just work for us, it doesn't work for a lot of people. And, you know, so for me in this too, it was kind of just, as Australia's seen of this place, you know, like there's a lot of mining and stuff going across the country, and degradation and environmental degradation and contamination, and you know, it's kind of like we need to have a conversation. We all need to have a conversation about this. You know, we can't keep our head under the pillows, you know, and ignore this. It's like we all need to have a conversation, because, you know, just as we are all victims of our past, we're all victim of our time now. And, you know, we're reasonable people. We can have a conversation around these issues and be real with each other, be real with our elected members, be real with the, you know, some of these bigger companies that are profiting from their, you know, unequal relationships.
Yeah, mahalo, John. I just want to highlight something you said. You know, we're victims of our past, but we're also victims of our present. And I highlight that because as much as you both validated the real violence and pain that happened in the past and the present, you also made space to talk about Indigenous agency and hope. You guys both ended on hope in your films. And I wanted to ask you more about that. What were some of your favorite moments from your film about Indigenous agency or beyond? Either the things that you could include or the things that maybe were behind the scenes that weren't in the film. I want to hear more about the hope that was offered through your films as well.
I think we could have made a feature. We talked about that quite a bit, but you know, I think budgets only go so far. So yeah, I think excuse me, Indigenous agency was really about handing that over to the people that were in the film and just really highlighting their voices, I think. Again, something that was really super important for me was a question that Kushla asked me was, who is this film for? And I've said this before, but I said, well, we're not making this for Māori people because Māori already know this story, even though, you know, in Pukekohe it was especially intensified. But this little microcosm of this town was a microcosm of many, many little towns all around Aotearoa, some of which I've been part of. So, you know, for me, it was really about, I was making this film for Pākehā people, for non-Māori. And that was my way of, I think, trying to open up conversation, because Māori already knew it. So in terms of like Indigenous agency, I love Māori stories. I really love, and it's a shame because a lot of them come from pain. You know, we're talking about trauma a lot. You know, and yeah, and I think that's probably something I'm going to try and explore, is how do you tell amazing stories that don't have a lot of pain, that you're not drawing from a lot of trauma to, you know, have story arc and all that kind of stuff. So that's probably something I need to look into. But I think it's really about healing, you know, when you give people a platform, like those old people in the film, you know, they'd never been heard before. And finally, in their late 70s and early 80s, they're like being heard for the first time. And the amount of healing that it brought to them by the end of the film, like when they came up to me and they were just like, oh, that was actually really, I feel better, like I feel lighter, you know, even though it's not going to, you know, change much of their experience or anything. What it did do was, it was like, oh, you can hear me, you can, you know, and so I think that honoured their family as well, because finally it wasn't just the children who were listening to the pain of their parents, but now the rest of the country was able to find some empathy for their point of view.
And mahalo, I love hearing. I did have a question that we won't get to today about how your interview chair was a site of healing, it seemed, for a lot of the elders in the film. And I love how you said that they feel lighter. In Hawaiian, the word kaumaha means sad, but also heaviness, a burden. And so to be able to be heard, like we're saying today, be heard, be listened to, be seen, is clearly so critical to have that burden lifted. John, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting, Corinna, what you're saying too with trauma, and like as Indigenous filmmakers, you know, how do you make something in a way that doesn't re-traumatize, you know, as well, and your responsibility, you know, to you know, your community, and I think, you know, and it's a real challenge, and it was particularly with this film, with an archival film, because there's footage from right across the country, and you know, it's you know, talking to communities about that, and I think what I found too was, like, say for example, there was a cut we had in the film, and you know, it's people's families that they're seeing who have since maybe passed on, and you know, awful meetings happening with government around land issues, and you know, land being taken away within a meeting, and you know, it's incredibly upsetting for people. It's upsetting to, it's kind of twofold. It's upsetting for people to see that, but also it's important for people to see that, and for communities to hear that and what happened then. And so, you know, for me, it just brought up really kind of this thing of this film footage and who owns it, where does it belong, how does the community access it, is it just in these archives down in the, you know, city areas, and because it's important for people to understand what happened at the time and the conversations. So I was quite aware of that, and I think in making this film too was about, often thought of young Indigenous people here who just do so amazing, gathering people, protests, and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, and spoke to Gary Foley about that as well, and about that this is like it's an understanding of what has happened before and the path that they're continuing to walk, and an injection in the art, a boost as well, for those tireless footsteps, along the pavement, and to keep that your voice is important, and to keep your voice there. It's easy to get caught away behind the keyboard, but there's nothing like the gathering of people and a united physical voice together to show, to support each other. And I think the other thing in this film too, and just around the trauma and stuff too, was at that time they had a comedy group, Basically Black, and there's really fantastic satirical kind of sketches and stuff, showing what it was like, showing the system, showing the relationship with police, and politically incorrect stuff. Just, it was fantastic. And so we kind of, we weave some of that into it. And, that was the sort of, not only the feeling of the time, but I think also something that we speak about in our communities is humor, and that's a massive part of this kind of resistance, to this thing. And the thing about humor, I thought too, within the film is there's something about humor within our communities that's so innate within our communities, and shows a fine understanding of relationships to each other, ourselves, how we see ourselves in the world, that is just unique to communities. And when dealing with archival footage that's so Western and colonial, it's nice to keep that energy and keep that thread through this, because whilst there's these protests on the streets and these things happening, there is also this laughter that's happening side by side, and it's never lost, and it gives strength and brings people together as well, So it's important to remind, remind us all.
I can't wait to see your film, John.
Likewise, Corinna, likewise, yeah.
Well, mahalo nui to you both for such a lovely conversation. I love where you brought the conversation, John, here at the end, where humor is something that binds us, that unites us. And I don't know how much time we have. I'm going to slip one more question in. I am wondering, you kind of already talked about this, uniting maybe Indigenous folks across what is now known as Australia, and Corinna around Aotearoa. I'm wondering, since we have you both here, how we might be able to unite across the Pacific, across Indigenous communities globally, and how filmmaking might have a role in that, uniting that solidarity.
Are you talking about collaborations?
Sure, yes, collaborations.
That would be really, really super exciting. Like, imagine if we had a film. Well, I guess they're kind of doing that at the moment, aren't they? Where they're doing anthology films, where it's kind of like 8 shorts and a feature film. I guess, yeah, we kind of haven't. That hasn't been done around using that kind of technique is like possibly with Hawaii, with, I know there's been one that's my friend recently did one with Australia, a collab that was amazing, short films. yeah, I guess how can we do it? Is it about going to each other's lands and islands and wānanga workshops, and yeah, I think it's really about wanting to, what are our similarities and where do our stories, you know, there could be something really interesting in that, like similar stories coming together but told through different cultures. There could be something interesting in that, because we all have very similar creation stories, or I'm not too sure. I think I need to marinate on that a little bit more.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's something I think about a bit here, and like I talk to to other mob, and just it's so easy to get caught in these lines, these borders, and that they've restricted our traditional trade and travel and connection in so many ways, and how to kind of really step aside from that, and go back to things that were in existence, before those borders were there, or regulated in such a kind of almost military way now. And I think for me it's almost like twofold. It's like these finding those projects where we can collaborate as storytellers across and finding themes and things, and I think also just how we use the medium, and I'm a really big fan of, this is just a medium. That's all it is. It's like, I've seen what people do with, a stick with some, brushes and, some canvas material, and do incredible things. And I think one of the biggest things for this is we have so much incredible Indigenous knowledge within our communities. And sometimes the problem with this medium is it's just constructed so narrowly, and just because of the view of the world and everything. And I think, and we, find ourselves struggling that, because even to finance films, you're financing it from a colonial system who's go, I need a script or something to tick a box, or I need these things to tick this box, so, we're kind of up against it in many different ways. But the more that we have these incredible storytellers in our communities, and how we give access to this medium for those stories and that knowledge is a wonderful thing to share, I guess, because the process of it, and it's it's a great question.
Yeah, I reckon there's something around our shared stories, like our shared creation stories. And maybe that, because perhaps there's some similarities in there, and it'd make a really great meeting. We talk about how you would approach something like that.
Absolutely. And I have to credit Liz Soto for that question. She gave me that one. It was a really good one. She said, this is a great opportunity to ask this question with amazing Indigenous filmmakers in the room. And Corinna, yes, absolutely. I know from Hawaiian cosmologies, our Earth Mother is Papahānaumoku, very similar to
Papatuanuku.
Sounds exactly the same for a reason. And so much of our stories are similar, and unfortunately also similar because we're both under settler colonial institutions and structures, but it also gives us lots of space for collaboration and solidarities and movement building and growth. I do want to respect both of your times. Thank you so much for coming and giving so much to both this film and to our interview here today. So mahalo nui.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, all of you, for this amazing conversation. I'm so grateful that we're able to have this conversation and host this conversation today with all of you. A special mahalo to Pōmaika for moderating the conversation. Corinna, we really look forward to seeing you in person this coming weekend. And again, big mahalo, John, for joining us as well. I just want to go over a few housekeeping bits before we go. I want to remind everybody that we are screening these two films together on the 14th of October at 5:45 p.m. And then we'll have an encore showing on the 17th of October. You can find full information about the screening and grab tickets at HIFF.org. Also on the website, on the page for No Māori Allowed and Still We Rise, you can also access a companion essay that was written by Shannon Pōmaika Hennessy. You can read that at your leisure, and we'll also have those at the screening. So you can grab one of those at the screening as well. Another huge mahalo to Hawaii Council for the Humanities, our longtime partner in presenting our Film for Thought program. We're incredibly grateful for their support and making this program possible. If you like this program and these films, please check out the other films in the series, Mustache and Join or Die. Lastly, but not least, I also want to thank our co-sponsor for this program, specifically for our No Māori Allowed Still We Rise program, Pacific Islanders in Communications. We are presenting our Pacific Showcase in partnership with Pacific Islanders in Communications this year. So if you are looking for more stories by Indigenous Pacific filmmakers, that is where to go. And again, you can find out the full information on all the Pacific Showcase programs and the Film for Thought programs at HIFF.org. Thank you all again, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Mahalo.
Mahalo.